The automated compliance report lit up the conference room screen at exactly 2:47 p.m., interrupting Cross Technology's quarterly review like a fire alarm. 23 investors. 12 senior executives. One very pale VP whose bold vision was about to become evidence in a fraud investigation. I watched from my desk 3 floors down as security escorted him out an hour later, his keycard already deactivated. The same man who'd stripped away my budget approval authority 6 weeks earlier, sneering about my excessive caution. Sometimes the numbers really don't lie. My name is Maria Reeves, and I've been Cross Technology's senior finance manager for 7 years. I built my reputation on accuracy, methodical review processes, and an unfortunate tendency to ask uncomfortable questions about vendor invoices that seemed too round, too convenient, or too rushed through approval channels. VP Gerald Hawkins found this irritating. "Maria, your prudence is admirable," he'd said during our last one-on-one, adjusting his cufflinks with practiced dismissal, "but in today's market, hesitation kills deals. We need finance partners who embrace calculated risk." Translation: I was slowing down his empire building with my tedious insistence on documentation and compliance protocols. The morning he reassigned my budget approval authority to Connor Walsh, a junior analyst with precisely 18 months of experience and an alarming enthusiasm for rubber stamping anything over 6 figures, I knew something fundamental had shifted in Cross Technology's risk tolerance. "Connor brings fresh energy to vendor relations," Hawkins announced during the department meeting. "Maria, you'll transition to reconciliation oversight." Connor beamed. The rest of the team studied their laptops with sudden fascination. I nodded professionally and began organizing my handover files that afternoon. Compliance handovers require meticulous documentation. Every approved vendor, every payment authorization, every override and exception gets cataloged, cross-referenced, and archived according to Sarbanes-Oxley requirements. It should have been routine clerical work. Instead, as I reconciled Hawkins' approval history against our general ledger, patterns emerged that made my forensic accounting training itch with recognition. Payments to shell vendors, Meridian Solutions, Pinnacle Consulting, and Ashford Services, showed consistent irregularities. Invoices for strategic advisory services that bypassed our standard vendor verification protocols. Each approval bore Hawkins' electronic signature, applied during off-hours when normal oversight mechanisms were offline. Each payment disappeared into accounts that terminated at Delaware P.O. boxes. The invoices were masterpieces of creative accounting. Round numbers that suggested estimates rather than actual work performed. Payment terms that demanded immediate wire transfers rather than standard 30-day processing cycles. I printed nothing. Made no notes on paper. Simply logged the discrepancies in a secure partition of our compliance database and continued my reconciliation work with practiced neutrality. But that night, lying awake at 3 a.m., I found myself calculating exactly how much Cross Technologies had hemorrhaged through these phantom consultancies. $2.3 million over 14 months. Marcus Tang found me in the break room the following Tuesday, stirring my coffee with unusual deliberation. As our senior IT auditor, Marcus specialized in digital forensics and maintained the social profile of office furniture: quiet, essential, frequently overlooked. "Interesting accounting access patterns in the system lately," he mentioned, refilling his water bottle. "Lots of approval overrides. Timestamp analysis shows most happened after standard business hours." I kept stirring. "Oh? Electronic signatures can be traced, you know. Every keystroke, every login session, every control bypass." He capped his bottle carefully. "Amazing what people don't realize about digital audit trails." He left his business card beside the coffee machine. That evening, I found a secure file transfer link in my personal email. No message, just access credentials and a folder labeled System Access Logs, Q1 Q2 Review. Marcus had documented everything. Login sessions at midnight. Approval overrides during weekends. Electronic signatures applied in bulk to vendor payments that never underwent standard procurement review. The evidence was comprehensive, time-stamped, and absolutely damning. I studied the logs until 2 a.m., cross-referencing them against my compliance database. Every suspicious payment I'd cataloged corresponded perfectly with Hawkins' after-hours system access. But I also noticed something else: Connor's approval patterns had started mimicking Hawkins' behavior. Recent vendor payments showed the same bulk processing signatures, the same after-hours timestamps. Either Connor was learning bad habits from his mentor, or Hawkins was using Connor's login credentials to maintain plausible deniability. The next morning, I observed Connor more carefully. He looked tired, stressed. "How are you settling into vendor management?" I asked casually. "It's challenging," he admitted. "Gerald's been helping me understand the strategic importance of maintaining vendor relationships. Sometimes that means being flexible with normal procedures." Which meant Connor was unknowingly providing electronic signature authority for approvals that Hawkins processed without proper oversight. The quarterly investor review was scheduled for Thursday at 2 p.m. Standard agenda, budget performance, growth projections, and Hawkins' presentation on strategic vendor partnerships. I spent Wednesday evening preparing an automated compliance report to run during the quarterly review, cross-referencing vendor payments against SEC disclosure requirements. The beauty of automated systems is their complete indifference to timing or political considerations. They simply execute their programmed parameters with mechanical precision. Thursday morning, Connor knocked on my office door, practically vibrating with excitement about his first major investor presentation. "Maria, thanks again for all your handover notes. Really helped me understand the big picture of vendor relationships." I smiled and wished him luck. At 2:47 p.m., Cross Technologies' compliance monitoring system detected multiple SEC reporting violations related to undisclosed related party transactions and generated an immediate breach notification to the board of directors, external auditors, and, per standard protocol, displayed a summary report on the main conference room screen. The report included vendor payment analysis, electronic signature authentication logs, and procurement policy violation tracking. I watched from my desk as the conference room erupted into controlled chaos visible through the glass walls. Hawkins found me in my office at 4:15 p.m., his usual composure replaced by something approaching panic. "Maria." His voice carried the controlled tension of someone whose world was actively imploding. "The compliance system malfunctioned during our investor review. Some kind of data corruption in the vendor payment reports." I looked up from my reconciliation spreadsheets. "That's unfortunate. Automated systems are usually quite reliable. The numbers are wrong. Completely inaccurate vendor classifications, payment timing issues, signature authentication errors." He leaned against my desk with practiced casualness that fooled neither of us. "I need you to issue a correction report immediately. Explain the system malfunction." "I'd be happy to review the compliance data," I replied carefully. "Could you specify which vendor payments appear inaccurate?" His composure cracked slightly. "All of them. The entire Q1 and Q2 payment analysis is corrupted. Delaware corporations classified as undisclosed related parties, standard consulting services flagged as policy violations." I pulled up the compliance database on my monitor. The system is actually functioning correctly. Those Delaware entities do appear to be shell companies based on our vendor verification protocols. The payments were processed outside standard procurement channels using after-hours approval overrides. Hawkins straightened slowly. "You're telling me you can't correct obviously erroneous compliance flagging?" "I'm telling you the flagging isn't erroneous." I turned my monitor toward him, displaying the vendor analysis Marcus and I had compiled. These payments violated multiple procurement policies, SEC reporting requirements, and internal controls. The automated system correctly identified them as compliance violations. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. "Maria," he said finally, his voice dropping to something more dangerous than his usual condescension, "I'm hoping you understand the implications of what you're suggesting." "I'm not suggesting anything," I replied evenly. "I'm documenting compliance violations that occurred under your approval authority. It's my job." His face cycled through several expressions before settling on cold fury. "Your job is whatever I say it is. And right now, your job is fixing this system error before it destroys the company's investor confidence." "No," I said quietly. "Right now, my job is ensuring Cross Technologies complies with federal reporting requirements. Which means these violations get reported to the SEC within 14 days. He left without another word. Security escorted him from the building 47 minutes later. Or executive career trajectories. Connor appeared in my office doorway at that moment, looking confused and increasingly distressed as he absorbed the hostile atmosphere of our conversation. "Gerald? Maria? Is everything okay? The board members are asking to speak with both of us about the vendor payment discrepancies." Hawkins turned toward Connor with an expression that shifted rapidly from fury to calculated compassion. Connor, there's been a system malfunction that's generating false compliance alerts. Maria's having difficulty correcting the errors. Connor looked between us uncertainly. But the data matches what I've been processing. Those vendor payments, the after-hours approvals, the Delaware companies. His voice trailed off as understanding dawned. Oh. Oh no. The realization that he'd been unknowingly facilitating fraud was devastating to watch. Connor's face went through the same emotional progression I'd experienced weeks earlier: confusion, recognition, horror, and finally the sick understanding of personal liability for crimes he hadn't knowingly committed. Connor, I said gently, you need to speak with legal counsel before talking to the board. You've been manipulated into providing electronic signatures for approvals that violated company policy and federal regulations. Hawkins stepped toward Connor with predatory focus. Don't listen to her paranoid conspiracy theories. She's trying to sabotage the company because she resented being reassigned. But Connor was too intelligent to miss the implications of what he'd learned. The vendor verification forms I signed, most of them were incomplete. You said the missing information wasn't critical for strategic partners. Standard business practices, Hawkins replied quickly. Mature organizations balance compliance requirements with operational efficiency. The after-hours approvals, Connor continued, his voice gaining strength as the full scope of the manipulation became clear. You said urgent market opportunities required flexible timing. Connor. The Delaware companies that never delivered any actual services. Connor looked directly at me. You tried to warn me during the handover meeting, didn't you? About documentation requirements and approval procedures. I nodded. I documented my concerns in the transition files. Hawkins left without another word, understanding that his influence over Connor had evaporated along with his plausible deniability about the fraudulent vendor payments. Security escorted him from the building 47 minutes later, his keycard deactivated and his office sealed pending the internal investigation that would inevitably expand into federal regulatory scrutiny. Connor spent the next 3 hours with legal counsel, cooperating fully with the board's preliminary investigation and providing detailed testimony about the approval procedures he'd been following under Hawkins' direction. Data corruption in the vendor payment reports. I looked up from my reconciliation spreadsheets. That's unfortunate. Automated systems are usually quite reliable. The numbers are wrong. Completely inaccurate vendor classifications, payment timing issues, signature authentication errors. He leaned against my desk with practiced casualness that fooled neither of us. I need you to issue a correction report immediately. Explain the system malfunction. I'd be happy to review the compliance data, I replied carefully. Could you specify which vendor payments appear inaccurate? His composure cracked slightly. All of them. The entire Q1 and Q2 payment analysis is corrupted. Delaware corporations classified as undisclosed related parties, standard consulting services flagged as policy violations. I pulled up the compliance database on my monitor. The system is actually functioning correctly. Those Delaware entities do appear to be shell companies based on our vendor verification protocols. The payments were processed outside standard procurement channels using after-hours approval overrides. Hawkins straightened slowly. You're telling me you can't correct obviously erroneous compliance flagging? I'm telling you the flagging isn't erroneous. I turned my monitor toward him, displaying the vendor analysis Marcus and I had compiled. These payments violated multiple procurement policies, SEC reporting requirements, and internal controls. The automated system correctly identified them as compliance violations. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. Maria, he said finally, his voice dropping to something more dangerous than his usual condescension, I'm hoping you understand the implications of what you're suggesting. I'm not suggesting anything, I replied evenly. I'm documenting compliance violations that occurred under your approval authority. It's my job. His face cycled through several expressions before settling on cold fury. Your job is whatever I say it is. And right now, your job is fixing this system error before it destroys the company's investor confidence. No, I said quietly. Right now, my job is ensuring Cross Technologies complies with federal reporting requirements. Which means these violations get reported to the SEC within 14 days. He left without another word. Security escorted him from the building 47 minutes later. The aftermath unfolded with bureaucratic inevitability, though the process proved more complex and politically fraught than I'd anticipated. The board of directors convened an emergency session the following morning, engaging a prestigious law firm to conduct an internal investigation while simultaneously preparing for inevitable SEC scrutiny. Cross Technology's stock price dropped 14% in after-hours trading as news of the compliance violations leaked to financial media outlets. Janet Crawford found herself in the uncomfortable position of explaining to investors how a $2.3 million fraud had operated under her oversight for 14 months. During the emergency board meeting, she attempted to characterize the situation as an isolated incident involving a single rogue executive, but the board's forensic accounting review revealed systemic control weaknesses that implicated senior management. "We're implementing comprehensive procurement reforms," Janet announced during the hastily scheduled investor call, including enhanced vendor verification procedures, mandatory secondary approvals, and real-time compliance monitoring systems. The reform sounded impressive but essentially codified the procedures I'd been advocating for months before Hawkins eliminated my oversight authority. Connor's situation proved particularly complicated. External auditors determined that his electronic signatures on fraudulent vendor payments created potential legal liability, despite clear evidence that he'd been manipulated into providing approvals without adequate information. The company's legal counsel recommended reassigning him to a position with no financial approval authority while the investigation continued. "I feel like an idiot," Connor told me during a private conversation in the break room, weeks after the scandal broke. "All those red flags you tried to explain during the handover meeting. I thought you were just being overly cautious." "You were set up to fail," I replied honestly. Hawkins specifically chose someone without enough experience to recognize the warning signs. That was the point. Connor was eventually reassigned to accounts receivable analysis, a significant demotion that eliminated his vendor management responsibilities but allowed him to remain with Cross Technologies while rebuilding his professional reputation. He approached the new role with humbling determination to master every compliance procedure and internal control mechanism the company maintained. The shell vendor payments required extensive litigation to recover. Meridian Solutions, Pinnacle Consulting, Ashford Services, and Westridge Strategic Partners had dissolved their Delaware corporations and transferred funds through multiple offshore accounts designed to complicate asset recovery efforts. Cross Technology's legal team ultimately recovered $1.8 million of the original $2.3 million, plus penalties and interest that partially offset the investigation costs. The recovered funds were redirected toward the technology upgrade projects and employee training programs that had been deferred due to resource constraints, a detail that felt personally satisfying given how many legitimate business needs had been sacrificed to fund Hawkins' fraudulent vendor payments. Cross Technology's board implemented sweeping procurement reforms that exceeded regulatory requirements. Enhanced vendor verification procedures now required comprehensive background checks, reference verification, and deliverable documentation for all consulting contracts. Mandatory secondary approval became required for vendor payments over $25,000, with additional board review for any contract exceeding $75,000. Real-time compliance monitoring systems, expanded from the automated reporting tools that Marcus and I had deployed, now generated continuous analysis of approval patterns, vendor payment clustering, and electronic signature authentication. The new systems eliminated the possibility of systematic fraud operating undetected for extended periods. I was quietly restored to full budget approval authority 6 weeks after Hawkins' termination, along with a salary adjustment that HR described as reflecting my demonstrated commitment to fiscal responsibility and regulatory compliance. The promotion came with expanded oversight responsibilities for vendor management and procurement policy enforcement. Marcus received formal recognition for his proactive system monitoring initiatives and was promoted to Director of IT Audit and Compliance. His new role included responsibility for designing the enhanced monitoring systems that would prevent future fraud attempts. He approaches these responsibilities with the same methodical precision he'd applied to documenting Hawkins' violations. We occasionally share coffee in the break room and discuss the peculiar reliability of automated compliance systems, though our conversations maintain the same carefully neutral tone that had characterized our collaboration during the investigation. Angela Foster, our accounts payable manager, was promoted to Senior Finance Operations Manager with specific responsibility for vendor verification and payment processing oversight. Her 12 years of institutional knowledge proved invaluable during the procurement system overhaul, and her natural skepticism about unusual payment requests became a formal part of the approval workflow. I always wondered about those Delaware companies, she told me during one of our coordination meetings. But I figured if the VP approved them, they must be legitimate. The company's investor confidence, contrary to Hawkins' predictions, actually improved following the fraud disclosure. The board's decisive response to the violations, combined with comprehensive reform implementation, demonstrated institutional commitment to transparency and robust internal controls. Markets reward predictable governance, Janet explained during a subsequent quarterly review, her presentation style notably more humble than before the scandal. Investors prefer companies that identify and address problems proactively rather than organizations that hide systemic weaknesses until external forces expose them. Cross Technology's stock price recovered within 3 months and ultimately exceeded pre-scandal levels as investors recognized the competitive advantages of enhanced compliance systems and strengthened internal controls. The SEC investigation concluded 8 months later with a modest fine for reporting violations and a consent decree requiring annual compliance audits for 3 years. The relatively lenient treatment reflected the company's cooperation during the investigation and proactive implementation of corrective measures. Hawkins faced criminal charges for wire fraud and securities violations. His trial generated modest media attention in regional business publications, primarily as a case study in executive misconduct and internal control failures. He ultimately pled guilty to federal fraud charges and received a 4-year prison sentence, along with restitution requirements that would consume most of his remaining assets. His resignation from Cross Technologies triggered a non-compete agreement violation that eliminated his severance package and required repayment of performance bonuses he'd received based on the fraudulent cost savings metrics. The broader implications extended beyond Cross Technologies. Industry associations began incorporating our compliance monitoring approaches into best practice recommendations for mid-size corporations. The automated reporting systems that Marcus designed became template models for similar organizations seeking to strengthen internal controls without adding bureaucratic friction to legitimate business operations. 18 months later, I delivered the keynote presentation at the Regional Finance Managers Conference, addressing an audience of nearly 300 professionals from across the Midwest. The presentation title was Automated Compliance Monitoring, Tools and Best Practices for Fraud Prevention in Corporate Procurement. The conference organizers had positioned my session as the closing keynote, following a full day of technical workshops on regulatory compliance, internal controls, and risk management. The audience included senior finance executives, compliance officers, internal auditors, and IT professionals, exactly the people who needed to understand how systematic fraud operates and how organizations can implement effective detection systems. Fraud prevention isn't about suspicion or paranoia, I began, clicking through slides that showed anonymized data patterns from the Cross Technologies investigation. It's about designing systems that make misconduct visible before it can cause significant damage. The audience was notably attentive during my section on detecting approval pattern anomalies through timestamp analysis, electronic signature authentication, and vendor verification protocols. Several attendees took detailed notes during my explanation of automated monitoring systems that could identify shell companies and suspicious payment clustering. The key insight, I continued, is that systematic fraud always leaves digital traces. Modern procurement systems generate vast amounts of data about approval workflows, payment timing, vendor interactions, and administrative access patterns. The challenge isn't collecting this data, it's analyzing it in ways that reveal meaningful patterns. I walked through the technical architecture that Marcus had developed for Cross Technologies' enhanced compliance monitoring, explaining how real-time analysis could flag potential violations without disrupting legitimate business operations. Automated systems don't suffer from organizational politics, career concerns, or interpersonal dynamics that might discourage human whistleblowers from reporting suspicious activity. They simply execute their programmed parameters and generate alerts based on objective data analysis. During the Q&A session, questions revealed that similar procurement vulnerabilities existed across multiple industries and organizational sizes. A healthcare finance manager described vendor payment irregularities that sounded disturbingly familiar. A manufacturing executive mentioned after-hours approval patterns that her IT department had flagged but management had dismissed as operational efficiency measures. Afterward, a junior manager from a competing firm approached me privately in the conference center lobby. "We've been having some unusual vendor payment patterns in our system," she said carefully, glancing around to ensure privacy. "I was wondering if you might have some time to discuss your monitoring protocols." I gave her my card and suggested she speak with her IT audit team about implementing comprehensive access logging and vendor verification procedures. The most important thing, I told her, is documenting everything before you raise concerns with management. Data speaks louder than suspicion. What if management doesn't want to hear what the data is saying? Then you make sure external auditors have access to the documentation during their next review cycle. She nodded thoughtfully and thanked me for the advice. 6 weeks later, I received a follow-up email from her reporting that automated compliance monitoring had identified $400,000 in questionable vendor payments at her company. The board of directors had launched an internal investigation and was implementing enhanced procurement controls based on the cross-technologies model. Similar conversations occurred with increasing frequency. Conference presentations led to consulting requests from organizations seeking to strengthen their internal controls. Professional associations invited me to speak about fraud prevention at regional meetings and continuing education seminars. Marcus and I co-authored an article for the Journal of Corporate Compliance titled Real-Time Fraud Detection in Automated Procurement Systems. The article became one of the publication's most downloaded resources and generated speaking invitations from accounting firms, audit committees, and regulatory agencies. Cross Technologies leveraged our compliance expertise as a competitive differentiator in client relationships. Prospective customers appreciated working with vendors who demonstrated transparent financial controls and robust internal audit procedures. Our enhanced compliance systems became selling points during contract negotiations with Fortune 500 clients who had experienced their own vendor fraud incidents. Operational integrity creates market advantages, Janet observed during a company-wide meeting celebrating our largest quarterly revenue in 5 years. Clients trust organizations that can demonstrate systematic approaches to risk management and regulatory compliance. The success validated my long-held belief that thorough compliance procedures strengthen rather than constrain business operations. I still maintain detailed reconciliation files. Still ask uncomfortable questions about vendor invoices that seem too convenient or rushed through approval channels. Still insist on documentation and verification protocols that some find excessively cautious. The difference now is that Cross Technologies has embraced systematic skepticism as an organizational strength rather than a bureaucratic impediment. New employees receive comprehensive training on fraud recognition, compliance monitoring, and internal reporting procedures. I'm usually modest, but I like to say I had played a big part in this corporate cultural shift.